Welcome to Malifaux University. 106. Vertical Movement. Now that we know how to move around on the table, let's look at vertical movement, which includes scaling, climbing, falling, and jumping. Climbing and falling have been around forever, but are handled differently in 4th edition than in previous editions. Jumping and scaling are completely new to 4th edition, so even veteran players should take the time to get familiar with all of these ways of getting on and off of terrain. Malifaux 4th edition places a strong emphasis on using the height of terrain during the game. Some victory points can be scored only from on top of terrain. At the same time, Wyrd recognized that it was impractical to have models spend their entire activations climbing to the top of terrain just to be killed or knocked off by their opponents. This is where scaling comes in. After ending a walk action, if your model is in base contact with climbable terrain it's not already standing on, it can scale that terrain. Very simply, you place the model on top of the terrain as if it had scurried right up the side of it. What you're really doing is moving the model straight up the side and then over until its base is 100% supported by the terrain. If you can't get the base 100% supported, you need to get it at least 50% supported. If you can't scoot the model over that far, then cancel the whole scale movement and put your model back where it was. This also works in reverse. If your model is on top of terrain and ends a walk action at the edge of that terrain, you can scale down the terrain, moving your model straight down the side until its base is 100% supported when possible, or at least 50% supported if not. Usually, this means it goes all the way down to the table, but this could mean it scales down to a lower rooftop, a crate, or something similar. Speaking of other terrain, if there's another object or model in the way of where you would put your model after scaling, you can't scale in that spot. If Minako Rei walks over to this height 4 building and ends her action here, she cannot scale the building because Charles Hoffman is standing where she would need to wind up. The situation would be the same if there were a crate or an ice pillar marker in that spot. If this happens to your opponent, the nice thing to do would be to let him change the walk action to here or here where your model wouldn't be in the way. Just keep in mind that scaling happens at the end of a walk action, and if changing the direction of the walk means you don't wind up in contact with the terrain, or its edge if you're on top of it, then you can't scale it. Climbing is a more traditional way of getting up and down terrain, and it takes place during a walk action. A model can start a walk action, move to the edge of a climbable terrain piece, and then keep going up or down the side of that terrain. Once it reaches the top, it keeps going until its base is at least 50% supported, but if it still has movement to go, it can keep going. Say Minako Rei wants to get to the other side of this inch-wide, height 2 wall. Her speed stat is 6, and she's 1 inch away from it. Taking the walk action, she moves the inch to it, climbs up 2 inches, moves 1 inch over. That puts her completely on top of the wall. She moves 1 inch to get off of it, climbs 1 inch down, and she's out of movement. She's 1 inch away from the table and falls that 1 inch. We'll discuss falling in a minute, but she suffers no damage. Her movement ends because she went all 6 inches of her speed stat. Climbing is ideal for short terrain like this, but if you're working with taller climbable terrain, you will usually be better off scaling it at the end of your walk. And just remember that climbing is specifically a vertical movement. Climbing up or down a certain distance and then moving around the side of the terrain is not an option. Models that ignore terrain while moving also get to ignore its vertical distance. This Watcher has speed 7 and the flight ability that says it can ignore terrain and other models while moving. If it were chasing Minako Rei, it could fly right past that wall and Minako, placing itself on the other side of her here to keep her from getting away. Similarly, Toast has the all-terrain turtle tactical action that lets it move 4 inches, ignoring models and terrain. If Toast were on top of this height 4 building with a red cap between it and the edge, this action would let Toast measure 4 inches out and place itself on the table at that point, completely disregarding the 4-inch height of the terrain. I'll take a brief moment now to thank all those who were patrons at the time this video was made, especially Mats by Mars, Sergey, Tom, Alan, Jason, Jeremy, Mikulai, Oleg, Tomas, and Travis, and many more at the free student tier. Your support is essential to bringing these videos to life. Now we get to falling. Falling is a long-standing game mechanic in Malifaux that many players have learned to use to their advantage through tricks and nuance. With that in mind, the rules about falling are fairly detailed, but can be as simple as anything else in Malifaux if they are interpreted correctly. As we said before, falling occurs anytime your model's base is not at least 50% supported by terrain or the table, except for when you're actively climbing or scaling. This may require some interpretive judgment, but having conversations before the game about what terrain will and will not hold models is important to playing friendly games. Falling damage occurs when you fall 2 or more elevations. It deals 1 irreducible damage to your model and stops its movement if it had any left to go. Now, what's an elevation? Generally, it's an inch, and an elevation is any portion of an inch beyond the whole number. 1 inch is 1 elevation, 2 inches is 2 elevations, and so on. But 1 1/4 inches or 1 1/2 inches also counts as 2 elevations. This is why you need to discuss terrain before the game. The buildings may really vary from 3 1/2 inches to 4 1/4 inches, but you and your opponent may say they're all just height 4. Malifaux math may dictate that the taller of those two be rounded up to height 5, but that's for you and your opponent to establish during setup. Models that ignore terrain while moving do not suffer falling damage. When Toast was on top of that building and rolled through that red cap and onto the table, it did not suffer falling damage. Since it takes 2 elevations, or more than an inch, to suffer falling damage, this usually means that you can fall up to an inch without taking damage. But if you suffer falling damage, it stops your movement. If you want to keep moving, the trick is to fall without climbing. Let's explain this through a few examples. Minako Ray, with her speed 6, is on top of this pile of height 1 crates. If she were to simply walk off this edge, she'd use 1 inch of her movement to get off the crates, and then fall 3 inches to the table, suffering 1 irreducible falling damage and ending her movement. If she wanted to avoid that, she could walk 1 inch off the edge, climb down 3 inches to the table, and then move the remaining 2 inches of her speed. Another option is to walk 1 inch off the edge, climb down 2 inches, and fall the remaining 1 inch to the table, but choosing to fall while climbing is at the end of the climb, and her movement would still be over. It makes little sense to use this third option, but you never know what's going to happen in a game. Maybe that's exactly where she needs to be. Going the other direction, the crates form 1 inch steps. Minako can walk 1 inch to fall to the next one down and keep going since she didn't suffer falling damage. In fact, she can keep going like that all the way to the table, with 3 inches remaining once she reaches the table surface. Let's say an enemy model removed a crate with the slam action while Minako was still on top of the pile. She could walk 1 inch and fall to the middle crate, but then she'd have to make a choice. She could keep walking 1 inch and then climb the 2 inches down to the table, leaving her 2 inches to keep walking. Alternatively, she could climb just 1 inch down and then fall the remaining inch, ending her movement there. A third option would be to just walk off the crates, falling 2 inches and suffering falling damage and ending her movement, but again, that makes little sense to do to your own model. Speaking of self-harm, you cannot choose to kill your own model with falling damage. If Minako Ray on these crates was down to 1 health, she would not be allowed to choose any option that incurred falling damage which would kill her. With that said, if you can knock an enemy model off terrain or force it to walk or move off terrain and suffer falling damage that kills it, that is a perfectly acceptable way of killing a model. Which brings us to the last part of falling, where to put your model when it falls. Since falling normally occurs whenever the base is not adequately supported, most of the time the model falls straight down and stops when it hits the table or another piece of terrain that can support its base properly. Say your model falls and there's another model or a piece of impassable terrain, like an ice pillar marker or a pylon marker, in the way. Most of the time, you just pick a spot to the left or right of the model or object and put your model there, as close to where it would have landed had the object not been there. By you pick, I mean whoever is controlling the fall gets to choose where it lands. If another model is controlling your movement when you fall, it opens up a third landing option. So let's look at some more examples. A full health Minako Rei is on top of the crates and needs to go this way, though she will take falling damage. There's a height 2 impassable pylon marker in her way, so when she walks off the crates, she can choose to land either left or right of it. She'll take the 1 falling damage and end her movement. She can then take her second action. In another scenario, let's say that Minako has already activated, but the 10 Thunders player needs to get her off of those crates. This friendly beckoner has a lure action that causes Minako to move her speed toward the beckoner. It doesn't say to take the walk action, just move her speed. That means climbing is not an option, since that's a form of the walk action. Minako moves the 1 inch off the edge of the crates and falls the 3 inches to the table. Since she still has 5 inches left of her movement, she's allowed to fall on this far side of the pylon marker, but she will still take the falling damage and end her movement there. It would be the same scenario if the beckoner were the one in the way of Minako's fall instead of the pylon marker. Minako would be allowed to fall on this far side of the beckoner if the 10 Thunders player wanted. It would still be the same if it were an enemy model atop the crates being lured off by the beckoner. The third falling location would be allowed. The last form of vertical movement also involves horizontal movement, jumping. After coming up with climbing and scaling to get you on top of terrain, Wyrd doesn't want to make you go all the way back down just to climb back up another building. Jumping lets you get from one elevated position to another without going back to the table. When your model is on top of terrain, you can move it to the edge of that terrain and have it jump to another as long as the destination is the same height as where your model is starting or no more than 1 elevation lower. In other words, if you're on a height 3 building, you can jump to another height 3 building or a height 2 building, but not a height 1 or a height 4. Similarly, you cannot jump all the way to the table if the difference is greater than 1 elevation. To jump, simply move your model to the edge of the terrain it's on if it isn't there already. Measure out as if you were on the table, since all distance in Malifaux is measured horizontally. As long as the height difference allows it, and your model's base will be at least 50% supported where it lands, you can place the model at the destination. Now, if there's a model or object in the gap between the buildings, you can jump over it only if your model is at the same height or higher than the object or model in the way. Let's look at several examples. Minako Rei is back on the crates at an elevation of 3. There's a height 2 pylon marker here and a height 2 stack of crates on the other side of it, 4 inches away. Minako's speed stat is still 6, and she's at the edge of the crate. The pylon marker is not taller than Minako's elevation of 3, so she can ignore it. She measures out 6 inches and can safely land on top of the stack of crates. If we switched out the pylon marker for a height 5 ice pillar marker, Minako would not be able to make the jump since the impassable object between them is taller than her starting elevation of 3. If Minako's stack of crates were only height 2 and she wanted to jump to the other height 2 crates, the pylon marker still would not block her jump since it's not taller than her starting elevation. If her crate were only height 1 and she wanted to jump to another height 1 crate with the height 2 pylon marker in the way, she would not be able to jump. If the size 3 Jorogumo were in Minako Rei's crew and in the gap instead of the pylon marker, she would be able to make the jump because you can ignore friendly models when moving. If the only terrain around Minako when she's on the height 3 terrain were the table or height 1 terrain, she would not be allowed to make a jump. She could climb, scale, or fall down, but not jump, since the difference in elevation is more than 1. Lastly, if your model is on Height 1 terrain, it can jump up to its speed stat across the table. Minako Rei on this Height 1 crate could jump up to 6 inches away onto the table, even if there were a size 1 Malifaux rat in the way. After she lands, she can continue her movement as normal. One pro tip before we end the video. If you are controlling another model and it says to move that model, you cannot make it climb or scale terrain since those are tied to the walk action. Jumping, however, is tied to falling. So if you're controlling the movement of a model and could make it move and fall off of terrain, as long as there's a legal place for it to land, you could make it jump to that terrain. And that's the overview of vertical movement. Pick up a printable set of all the markers and tokens you need to play Malifaux in the Wargame Vault. If you haven't already, join our Patreon for early ad-free access to all new long-form content. And be sure to visit the Malifaux University gift shop for the latest in Malifaux-themed shirts, hoodies, drinkware, and more. Links are in the notes below. And remember, play friendly games, keep it simple, and have fun.